I want to start with this first story about President Macron. Now, he has been pretty vocal recently. I don't know if you guys have seen, but President Macron has been speaking about a global agenda. Now, this is interesting considering I would say President Macron may need to want to fix things in his own country first. Remember, there were people there protesting by the millions because he decided to implement that pension reform. So he doesn't seem to be okay with his own country and controlling things there. But when it comes to this global agenda that he's discussing about, and he has been on the world stage about this in the past couple of months, he has a lot to say. And one of the things that President Macron has decided to say is that the U.S. government and China are going to have to cooperate in order for us to have a global agenda. Now, am I here to say I disagree with that? No, I am not. But I am here to say it's interesting that he's trying to tell people what they need to do to make things right, but he doesn't seem to have that advice for himself in reference to his own citizens and in France. Listen to this interview that he had with CNN recently.
France and Washington have a special relationship. After all, France was the first military ally of the yet-to-be-formed United States during the Revolutionary War. But will that relationship hold, or will France and its neighbors find another path? After a 3-day visit to China in April, President Macron told reporters that Europe needed what he called strategic autonomy. He didn't want the continent to be a vassal or follower of either China or America. Here's more of my interview with the French president.
Before that comes in, I just want to jump in and say something really quick. That's another thing I forgot to mention. Just remember that it was just like a month or two ago that President Macron said that Europe should probably become its own like third world power and not get caught up between this rift in reference to the U.S. government and China.
Let's talk about China. You had a very important trip to China, and after you came back, you said some things that provoked a certain amount of opposition in Europe and particularly the United States. Most specifically, your comment on Taiwan. So I want to ask you, you said that Europe needs strategic autonomy. It should not be a vassal of either China or the U.S. And on Taiwan, we should be careful not to accelerate a crisis that is not ours. Mike Gallagher, the head of the China Committee in the House of Representatives, said these comments are disgraceful. Is there anything you want to clarify or change about what you said?
Look, I was very clear, and I want to be clear. First, on Taiwan, we are in favor of the status quo, which means we are dead against any aggression, and we do respect the existing model.
Okay, so I'm assuming what he means here when he says that we accept the existing model is that the one China policy, right? But at the same time, notice that he's talking out both sides of his mouth because he said that we don't want any form of aggression. So that also means that he does not want China, obviously, to intervene here, preventing Taiwan from getting some type of independence. So I hear him talking out both sides of his mouth, and that should concern you. The other thing that should concern you is notice that he said we are on board with the status quo. So what that means is that Macron is not like some progressive champion here. Yes, he's made the statement that the U.S. needs to learn how to work or cooperate with China. They need to work together, but that doesn't mean that he's like this progressive leader being brave and coming forward. He still agrees with the status quo. You have to remember where President Macron came from. Remember, he was a financier. So he comes from that business. He comes from the banking industry.
And this is what I reiterated with President Xi Jinping, and I understand this is exactly the position of President Biden. Second, I never put France in a sort of equal distance vis-à-vis China and the US. We are an ally in NATO, but through our history with the US, we do share the same values. We are economic competitors, but we are closely linked by history, by the alliance, and human relations and friendship. We want to have the best possible relation with China. we want and we have to work with China to fix climate change, biodiversity crisis, and a lot of conflicts in this world.
Let's hold right there for just a second. He said that he wants to have a working, like some type of working relationship with China. And he mentioned the climate crisis. Now, this is the part that's key, because I'm going to show you another clip after this where he specifically addresses the climate issue. Globally, when we talk about combating climate change, that has to be a global effort. We cannot have a global effort if other countries don't want to work with other countries. You're going to have to collaborate here. So that's one of those examples that he is giving, that when it comes to that particular situation, you're going to have to cooperate, or the US and China are going to have to find a way to work together. So just keep that in mind. I think that's a great example that he gave, but how far is Macron willing to go?
It's clear that we don't share all the same, all the same values, and we have very structural differences on human rights and so on. But we want to find the right way to respect each other.
He said they have very differences on human rights. What are the differences that they have on human rights? Okay, so millions of people were marching through the streets in France, begging you not to increase the retirement age, not to adjust their pension reform. Where does he actually really stand when it comes to human rights? And does that include workers' rights? Something to think about.
And we are competitor, and our willingness is to anchor China in the global order. This is exactly what we are doing here in this conference. So this is just to clarify the sort of perception that China and US could be put at the same level vis-à-vis France, which is not the case. But I want to insist on a point. For me, it's very important to have a much more autonomous Europe and European Union. Why? Because it's useful for the global order. I think it's useful even for the US. It's useful to have a more powerful Europe being in capacity to fix conflicts at its border. I think we are very lucky to have a US administration ready to engage in Ukraine today. Will it be the case in a few years or in a few decades? I'm not sure. The Europeans have to build themselves their capacity to preserve peace on their territory and in their neighborhood.
So let's talk about this for a second. What he's telling you is that there may come a time when the US government may not be willing to aid European countries that, quote unquote, say that they need it, like a country like Ukraine. That's happening right now, but Macron is trying to signal to you that a couple of years from now, or maybe 10, 20 years from now, that may not be the case. Things may change. And so if that is the case, that things could change, that is why he is saying that Europe should stick together and become a third world power, that they have to look out for each other and not always rely on the fact that the US government is going to be their ally in the future. This is huge news. I think people need to pay attention to, because it almost sounds like he foresees some type of significant change coming around the bank in reference to US politics.
Second, I want us, for our citizens, to be in a situation to be independent in terms of technology, defense, energy. I would say the key structures of a normal life. Why? Because nobody knows what could happen in the rest of the world. And if you are
Nobody knows what could happen in the rest of the world. Let me wind this back just a little bit. This is very telling, you guys.
I would say the key structures of a normal life. Why? Because nobody knows what could happen in the rest of the world. And if you are dependent on one country, you can be put in a very tricky situation the day you have a leadership in this country which decides to completely flip-flop. And it did happen. Guess what?
So there you go. He's telling you that Europe cannot continue just to depend on the United States. Does that sound familiar to you? Now, it may not be as extreme as what countries that are a part of BRICS are expressing right now, but it does sound a little bit similar to where even someone like Macron is starting to realize, can we depend on the US government forever? Or should we depend on each other? And if that is the case, if other European countries start to feel the same way that Macron is feeling, could it be possible that in the near future, sometime in our lifetime, we may see European countries form their own alliance similar to BRICS? Something to think about.
So I don't want to be put in such a situation again. So I think it's fair as a European to be very pushy for more autonomy. It's useful for the US from a defense point of view because this is burden sharing, and it's useful for the global order because it's having for the US an ally, being in a situation to discuss with some other people and big powers with which it's more difficult for the US. So I think it's not a lack of respect or disgraceful vis-a-vis the United States, what I said. And by the way, I discussed with President Biden before and after my trip, and we were very clear, and I can say that you have a president who was extremely clear regarding China and very sensible regarding this big interest, and he is not pushing for an increasing of the conflictuality. And
he's not? I don't know about that, Macron. I would say Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, I think that increases tensions. Also, Ed Markey making that trip as well. I would say the US government making claims that China has like these spy balloons, which turned out to be a weather balloon. I would say, again, that's just finding a way to escalate the tension. You know, it's like poking China in a way of sorts. So I don't know about that, Macron. I told you he talks out both sides of his mouth.
This is my last point on China and your question. My main objective was to say, through different initiatives and non-coordinated initiatives, we should not push the Chinese to overreact on the short run.
After you made those remarks about Taiwan, almost it seemed by coincidence, a poll came out in which they asked Europeans.
We'll go back to this point right here where he said we should not push them. See, even he realizes, look, this part right here, we should not push the Chinese to overreact on the short run. After you made those remarks about Taiwan, almost it seemed by coincidence, a poll came out in which they asked Europeans whether they would be willing to fight in Taiwan over Taiwan. So Macron says we should not push China, so we should not poke them. But at the same time, he says he stands with the US government and Joe Biden and his decisions on this issue as well.
We should not push the Chinese to overreact on the short run.
After you made those remarks about Taiwan, almost it seemed by coincidence, a poll came out in which they asked Europeans whether they would be willing to fight in Taiwan, over Taiwan. And overwhelmingly, people in Europe said no.
They do not want to be involved in this conflict. Look at this. How should Europe respond to a US-China war over Taiwan? 62% Europeans said remain neutral. 23% said support the US. 10% said they don't know. And 4.7% actually said support China. So this poll is very telling that Europeans don't want anything, for the most part, the majority don't want anything to do with this conflict. They want to remain neutral. And I think that's another reason why Macron made the statement that he made, because he probably already heard the sentiments from other European leaders like, whoa, 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 we've got behind the US on other issues, but not this one. When it comes to this China-Taiwan thing, listen, Macron, we're not getting involved in this. So next time you see Biden, you let him know we are not about that life, basically.
Do you think that vindicates the point you were making about Taiwan?
No, I mean, I'm always very cautious with polls because sometimes they are good, sometimes they are bad. And I think you have to design your strategy referring to as well the long-term interest for everybody. I think we have to be very strict on our values and perspective and global order. But I think this world needs less conflictuality because the top priority of our agenda is to fix global problems. I think for me the top priority of the global agenda is trying to fix the existing crisis, fighting against inequalities and poverty, and fixing climate change and biodiversity. Here are the key challenges of the decades to come, but especially this decade. I would add to this one, building a good framework and common regulation on artificial intelligence. Here are the key elements of a global agenda. To deliver on this agenda, we need cooperation, and especially we need cooperation between China and the US.
So you heard that. DC said Australia has said they won't back the US on Taiwan. So the land down under is out. This will be very telling, very telling. Rupert says Macron should ask Algeria what France should do. Ooh.
We did sign the Paris Agreement because President Xi and President Obama found an agreement a few months before. If there is no agreement between China and the US on all these topics, it's impossible to build a global agenda and to fix these issues. Here are my top priorities.
So what do you guys think about that? Do you think that that's true, that there needs to be some type of cooperation between the US government and with China in order for us to move forward with an issue like the climate crisis? And again, I've said this before, like that has to be a global effort. It can't just be the US does their own thing, China does their own thing, France does their own thing. In reference to climate change, that has to be a global front for people to fight for. So I think that I get where he's coming from in reference to that. But how would Joe Biden take that message? How would the US government take that message? How would they sit back and say, oh, Macron has a point? Or would they say, we do not want to work with China? Because see, here's the thing. If the US government starts to have some type of cooperation with China that Macron is suggesting here, what will they use to fearmonger the American people? What would they use? Oh, and by the way, that doesn't just mean cooperating with China. If you want all countries on board, that would mean Russia as well. Then what? What do they say? You see, then they'd have to change the narrative. Then they couldn't have the same narrative to tell people that China is the enemy or Russia is the enemy. They'd have to find a new enemy. But even then, it wouldn't work in reference to the climate crisis because all these countries would have to cooperate together. What would they do? What would they feed on to fearmonger the American people so that they can continue to make excuses for imperialism and war?
This is why I think for the critical elements where you will increase divisions and conflictuality and tensions between the US and China, we should try to moderate them, to find a way to, discuss quietly and build the relevant fora to decrease tensions, because our priority should be to fix these ones.
Mr. President, always a pleasure to have you on.
This is my...
Okay. So again, like I said, Macron, he talks out both sides of his mouth, but I think we'll give him a little bit of credit for at least being the first to come forward and say, look, this cannot happen. We have to work together to do this. And he also addressed this as well in reference to the summit that happened earlier this week. He also brought up this issue in reference to the climate crisis. Listen to this.
President Emmanuel Macron has called for concrete changes to the global lending system as the new Global Financial Pact summit kicks off in Paris.
In order to succeed and to fix together poverty, climate change, biodiversity, it's absolutely impossible to do it just with public money and official development assistance. So we have to create a collective dynamic, and we need much more from the private sector, much more from the sovereign funds, the asset managers, and all the private money you can channel towards precisely these objectives.
That is very interesting, considering, I wonder, do the banks agree with this? You know, he was a banker. So I wonder if they approve of this as well, because he said we need money from the private sector. I hope everyone heard that in order to tackle this particular issue. He also said in order to fix the poverty situation. Do the banks approve of this?
President Macron will be leading the summit with Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who has emerged as a key figure in the fight against climate change.
I ask us today not to leave Paris without understanding that the bolstering of the political ambition that is required must secure transformation and not reform. And I ask us to ensure that those of us who are heads of government and heads of state recognize that the world cannot continue in the shadow of an old imperial order that does not see countries, does not feel countries, does not hear countries, and worse, does not see, feel, or hear people.
And Ross Cullen joins us live from Paris. Ross, more than 50 heads of state at this meeting. Can we expect any concrete outcome?
Well, we heard from Mia Mottley there just in the introduction, the Barbados Prime Minister, real firepower speech from her during the opening session of this summit for a new global financial pact. She was saying that we cannot just mark the card. She said that there needs to be action, not some point in the future, in weeks or months. There needs to be action taken today so we can see results tomorrow. And she doesn't mean that kind of broadly in the rhetoric. She means tomorrow, Friday. She is very strong on this drive to try to have action at last in terms of supporting poverty reduction, supporting the fight against climate change, supporting the increased protection and preservation of biodiversity. Real kind of, that speech really set the tone. And we also heard from President Macron, the host, who played a short soundbite of him from the introduction. The summit is well underway. We have lots of heads of state here, from President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, President Lula of Brazil is here, number 2 in China, Li Qiang, the Premier. We can touch on his visit a little bit more in a minute. But there are leaders from across Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Caribbean as well, really trying to show that they are also the stakeholders in this drive to improve and reform the financing model for countries in the global south, so developing and emerging economies.
Okay, so that Global Pact Summit happened. You can find more information about that on YouTube, by the way. There's more people that reported on that. But, you know, when I watched those videos, I had to say to myself, okay, where do countries in Africa fit in reference to this whole global agenda? And I was curious, and I did a little bit of poking, a little bit of peeky peek. And I want to show you what African leaders said in reaction to France. So President Macron is also at this event here. And this is addressed directly to him. And you'll see him in this clip. Where do they fit in all of this? How do they feel? Listen to this.
You know, recently, 7 African countries decided to go and put a call for peace to Ukraine and to Russia. And we raised a number of issues. Zambia was represented, Comoros was represented, Republic of Congo was represented, Senegal was represented, Uganda, as well as South Africa. So we were all represented, and Egypt as well. So we were all at one, that even as we were going to address an issue of the war which has had a negative impact on the African continent, which is the rise in prices for food, rise in prices for fertilizers, we were clear that we are not going there as beggars.
Woo! let's pause right there. Let's pause, okay? It's getting a little hot in here. So I just want to remind you, a couple of weeks ago, I reported on the fact that even though countries in Africa chose to remain neutral in reference to this conflict with Russia and Ukraine, they have actually been hit pretty hard in reference to this war, because they too depend on that fertilizer, and they are having difficulty growing food. So they are being impacted in that way, even though they didn't choose to take a side at all, just chose to remain neutral. So you know what he just said? He said there were leaders who came forward to call for peace in reference to Ukraine. But he also just told you, when we come to the table, we are not coming there to be beggars. And this is important. When I saw this clip, I was like, say it again for the people in the back, because oftentimes when you have these global summits, these global agendas, a lot of times, like countries in Africa, it's like they're just left at the bottom of the list, or they're left out, or they're not considered to be a leader in the movement. Right now, you hear people like President Macron speaking up about these issues. You've heard Lula actively speaking up about these issues. Obviously, Vladimir Putin speaking up about these issues, the whole like BRICS team and things like that. But oftentimes, the African countries are drowned out a little bit. So I appreciate the fact that he said, when we come to the table, we are not coming there to be beggars. Oftentimes, the countries in Africa get what's left over. They get the end resort. Okay. So again, they are being affected heavily by this conflict with Russia and Ukraine, even though they did not even take a side in the conflict. He goes on, listen to this.
We're not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. We were going there to say, open up the Black Sea Channel so that the grains and the fertilizers should go into the world market. So we were not on a begging mission, even as we are in great need as a continent and all that. That should go to demonstrate that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals.
Boom. That part right there. That part right there. They want to be treated as equals. They're not coming there to beg. They're not coming there to ask for this sort of generosity. Let's make sure we help out the poor Africans. They're not looking for that. They want to sit at that table with people like Macron as an equal. As an equal. So what I think is really important for people to hear who are at this summit, and you can see there's Lula right there, and there's Macron. The look on his face is kind of funny. But, you think about these things. And I think it's very important that he made that statement.
Even in the multilateral institutions, we want to be treated as equals. And if our equity is at a low ebb, there must be ways in which that can be addressed.
So we talk about the multipolar, we talk about that like multipolarity. We've talked about all these different countries working together and not having like a unipower, but like a multipolarity, right? And what that would look like. And what that means is that even also for the countries of Africa, they're looking for a horizontal organization. Meaning that if you're going to be leaders on the world stage, they're going to have a say in this as well, as an equal, not as someone that you brought along with you to help them out. And that needed to be said. I'll let him finish this part here.
For us, this is very important. Our sovereignty is one of the things that we hold on dearly to. And we demonstrated that very clearly to both President Zelensky and to President Putin when it came to this issue. Even as there were suggestions that, yes, we can donate this, we can donate that, we said, we want you to release these grains and fertilizers to the world market so that the world can trade in these commodities and other issues we can handle in a different way. I wanted to make that point so that it should be understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world stage. Want to
The look on Macron's face, I'm sorry.
understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world
Look at the look on his face.
stage. Want to be key players even in the financial markets and in the MDBs.
That part right there. TLC said, ain't too proud to beg. African countries said, no, we are. We're not begging. We're going to be seen as your equal, or, you know, just leave us out of this altogether. And I think that needed to be said. So you have Macron talking out both sides of his mouth there. It'll be interesting to see what transpires from here, because I'm curious to see how this works out. I'm curious to see how this works out, but it should be interesting. What I will tell you is, based on what Macron has said, I would take it with a grain of salt, because the thing is he flip-flops a lot. So you could see that in that interview with CNN. He was like, well, we want this, but we feel this way and we feel that way. He was trying to both sides it. And so that tells you a lot about him. But the message is still out there. It was on CNN. So I know a lot of people saw that he said that the US government and China are going to have to come to some sort of cooperation in order for us all to move together. And he called out those two in particular. Thank you, philosophical thirst worms. Macron is the oddest neo-lib politician in the world. He is all over the place. You can find quotes of him from all over the political spectrum. Thank you so much for saying that. Sean says all the BRIC countries got more resources than the rest of Europe. Shout out to MC for becoming a Sabby member. Whoop, whoop, whoopity, whoop, whoop, whoop. And thank you for the super chat, Steve. Australian here. Our mainstream media are nonstop prepping us for war with China. I haven't heard anything but pro-war stances from Murdoch and Nine. Two companies own nearly all our press. Interesting. Thank you for letting me know that, Steve. You guys see what's happening? See what's going on?